Welcome. I'm chair of the Brookfield Town Democratic Committee and a member of the State Committee. Thank you all legislators and community members for coming this morning to this so-called coffee hour. The committee annually hosts a legislative breakfast at Vermont Technical College in Randolph in February historically to provide county legislators an opportunity to meet with interested community members about the current legislative session. Due to the pandemic, we have for the second year reformatted the event to take place via Zoom as we are now. And with good luck, and we hope to return next year to a person-to-person meeting. I hope you can return too, because we always have great baked goods and coffee. And of course, let me introduce our county chair, Sherry Merrick. I think Bob is going to let you see Sherry's picture.
Welcome.
And another member of our county committee who helped put this together, Billy Gosh. There she is. Hi, Billy. And lastly, I want to make sure you know, and you've heard a lot from now, Bob Farnham, otherwise known as Bob the Green Guy, who is our technology guru for things like this. First, we'll have the legislators each give a brief overview of their legislative assignments and activities in Montpelier. Once we've heard these introductions from the legislators, we will entertain questions from folks attending online. We also have a few questions from people who previously sent emails to us. So community members out there, please use the Zoom chat box to submit your questions and include your name and your town. So we're going to begin with the legislator introductions. Since we know Senator Kitchell must leave by 10 o'clock, let's start with her. Good morning, Jane.
I would like to say thank you for making this opportunity available. In some ways, I feel like perhaps it's my farewell speech in some regards, because we're in the process of reapportionment. And the Northeast Kingdom has lost population. And this Senate district that Senator Benning and I represent, a 2-seat district, is the topic or the subject of reconfiguration. And right now, it includes Caledonia County, but also 6 Orange County towns. Some of the proposals are talking about moving those, all but one of the Orange County towns, into a different Senate district. And that would leave Newbury, which is contiguous to the southern edge of Caledonia County. So this, we may be seeing a fairly significant change in how our senatorial districts are configured. We have other areas of the state that are gaining population, Franklin and Chittenden. So I expect what we're going to have is rather than the four senators in this configured district, which is the Northeast Kingdom plus Orange County plus some of Franklin and Lamoille, will be altered, yet to be finalized, but it's certainly the need to address the over-representation in certain areas of the state and under-representation in others has to be addressed. I serve on both the Appropriations Committee, I chair the Appropriations Committee, and then I serve also on Transportation. So certainly the federal funding that has come down has been a real focus of attention both on transportation as well as appropriations. And our work obviously is being informed by the work of other committees, particularly broadband, for example. And going around the state, the speaker in the pro tem had heard from hundreds and hundreds of Vermonters, and certainly the top concerns were housing and broadband and workforce needs. So those have been taking a lot of our attention. Also, I am pleased to announce that that in Vermont, the towns received money directly. It's about 176 million, I believe. And only one town did not apply for that funding to come directly to towns that can be used to address capital needs or a range of activities that would be permissible. And I think we are pleased that we funded the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and your regional planning commissions to actually support towns in the application process to help determine what expenditures would be eligible and also the fiscal reporting. So I think Vermont as a state did really well when other areas of the country actually turned away funding simply because of the complexity of the federal requirements. Housing, we just finished the Budget Adjustment Act. This is an adjustment to the 22 budget. We added more money for housing, 55 million. Also switched and used some general fund because the federal funds could not be used to leverage the federal tax credits. And we really wanted to maximize the funding that would be available to address housing, which everyone acknowledges is a very significant need. There are two other areas in terms of housing. One is an additional $20 million that's in a bill that would help landlords or property owners to rehab apartments that are currently vacant and need to have repairs to bring them up to code. Experience with the first round of funding was very good. And these are units that can be brought online much more quickly than new construction or major rehabilitation of particularly historic buildings. So workforce continues to be an area of great concern and how we support workforce needs. The other thing I would point out is the federal funding into the little state of Vermont has been over $10 billion. And that has had a very profound impact on state revenues and on the ed fund, which are experiencing surpluses. And the challenge for us is how to use the funding in the most strategic way possible, not build base expenditures, because the economists say after we get through this real huge influx of federal dollars and go back to state revenues as they would normally exist, we are talking about general fund state revenues growing about 2% a year. So the ideas and the requests for funding have been really substantial, but our challenge is to make sure that we're not building base expenditures at a level that are not sustainable and are really out of line with the projected revenues that are there. An area of concern, particularly for me, is everybody's focusing on, what is funded and how it's funded. But the governor's proposed budget includes only a 3% increase for our mental health and designated agencies and those agencies who serve our seniors and people with disabilities to keep them in their homes and in communities. And the governor's budget would provide only a 3% increase. And when you look, a number of these agencies actually are operating residential facilities with a cost of food and fuel and workforce. A 3% increase is really taking very fragile service delivery systems and weakening them further. So how we will address that funding need is a topic of discussion within the appropriations committees. Now, the other area that I would just mention is the projected shortfall in the transportation fund. And if we're going to be drawing down all the federal dollars available to the state under the new recently passed Federal Infrastructure and Jobs Act, it's going to take more money than we currently have in the annual revenues in the transportation fund. So that's another area that we're looking at. And I would point out that no fees have been increased. So for example, licenses or car registrations have not been, normally they have been increased for inflation on about a 3-year cycle. They have not been raised. And so the question really becomes, how do we make sure that we have the revenues on the state side to draw down all the available federal funding that can help with transportation, but also water, sewer systems, and other and broadband improvements. And for many smaller villages, wastewater and public water systems are really key to further housing development and can be a real constraint if they are not in place. So that's where we are on those two committees. Obviously, busy time, and we still have a lot of work to do as we put our 23 budget together. And I think that probably is a summary from my perspective. And I know we have a lot of legislators, so I will yield to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Jane. It sounds like you're pretty busy. We're next going to hear from Joe Benning.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Joe Benning. I am the junior state senator from the county district, which, as Jane said, consists presently of all of the Caledonia towns and the 6 northeasternmost towns in Orange County. There is good news and bad news with respect to the reapportionment. The bad news you've probably already picked up on to some extent. Right now, you have 3 senators on your screen. The next time you hold this, assuming it's next year, you're going to have 2 on your screen. And that is assuming that Newberry remains in the Caledonia district. If not, you'll only have 1 senator on your screen. But the lines that are being drawn right now on the reapportionment committees are a moving target in every sense of the word. I think last week, the district lines changed 3 times over the course of 7 days. And I anticipate that they will be changing again. The latest lines were drawn as of Friday, and I can say that there's still some moving parts that leave me wondering who on this screen will be in a different locality next time around. For anybody intending to run, trying to figure out where you're going to go around collecting signatures for your petition to get on the ballot is somewhat problematic at the moment. The good news is that as a result of a bill that I brought with Senator Tim Ash, the pro tem, a couple of years ago, the Chittenden 6-pack is being broken up. Presently, there are 6 state senators from Chittenden County. Now, this does not make a difference what party you happen to be affiliated with. The upshot was that county's 6-member block was totally out of whack with everywhere else in the country, not just Vermont. As a result of you living in Chittenden County right now, you have 6 state senators at your disposal. The latest map that I have seen as a result of the law that was passed is that they are calling for 2-member districts and 2 1-member districts for all of Chittenden County. That I'm sure is going to change again, but it gives you a flavor for what's happening there. There is a new law in place that says you cannot have more than 3 senators in any one senatorial district. And it looks like the folks in Chittenden are going to be broken up even more than that. So that's a piece of good news, because no matter what party you're in, that's going to be hopefully will bring some more balance to the conversation when the Senate reconvenes next year. I chair the Senate Institutions Committee. I am also a member of the Judiciary Committee. Talking about Senate institutions first for the purpose of this conversation, you may have heard that the Woodside Juvenile Facility closed down. We were expecting to have a replacement. The initial proposal was that the folks from an outfit called Beckett would put a facility in Newberry, but it was my understanding at the time that the proposal for Newberry would be made, and if the folks in Newberry objected to that, that they would back off that proposal. Unfortunately, that has not happened. Folks in Newberry objected strenuously. The state decided to appeal the decision, and the bottom line is it's in the middle of litigation, and I cannot tell you right now where a facility will be placed in Vermont. But if it is put in Newberry, my personal thought is that's not the best place for it. because there is simply no support services surrounding that particular location. And from my perspective, as someone who has dealt with the mental health system for a long time, that is absolutely the wrong place to have something when you don't have police, mental health facilities, a close local hospital, et cetera, all the support services for such a facility. I will shift. Well, I should also say that we kept money in the capital bill last year, the capital bill being the vehicle that goes through my committee. We kept money in the capital bill to complete the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail. I'm happy to say it's on target still for completion this October, and hopefully that will happen. And we will then have a 93-mile long linear park that will be absolutely beneficial to this entire area, including, in my humble opinion, Orange County. And I would hope that folks in Orange County would begin to understand that maybe you want to make a connection to the terminus, which would presently be in Danville. Moving over into judiciary, we've had a lot of conversation. Criminal threatening. Do you get rid of qualified immunity for police? There's a gun bill that the governor vetoed, S30, which is coming back into our committee. I have no idea where any of those conversations are going right now because they are all moving targets. But the committee has been quite active on several different fronts. I will skip my membership on LCAR, which is presently talking about the cannabis regulations for anyone who is going to open up a retail facility. But I was at the spear point for that conversation, having been one of the proponents of a retail marketplace in the Senate bill that created that. And that is all now subject to a conversation about the exact rules, which Mark Mcdonald chairs, and I'll let him speak more to that. With that, I'm going to close and let you know that I have to be in court this morning. So if you happen to go past 10 o'clock, it may be that I'll skip out. If I suddenly disappear, you'll know where I'm at. But thanks for inviting me, and I've had a very wonderful time in past events, especially when we were all in person. Traditionally, I think I was the only Republican present, and you folks all treated me very kindly and well, and I really do appreciate that. I look forward to coming back to you in a much different capacity next time around. And this officially is now my last forum for Orange County as a state senator, because I will not be running for that position again. So thanks.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Let's go to Mark Mcdonald, Senator Mark Mcdonald.
As Jane has told you, there's lots of money here in the state of Vermont. Senator Leahy has done well by us, and our job is to spend it wisely. As Jane said, we should be spending it on one-time purposes and not building up programs that we have to fund year after year once the money runs out. My priorities in the last couple of years have been to get off fossil fuels. Last year, we passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, which came out with a report that suggested we join the TCI, which would help us save money on motor fuels and help people in rural counties burn less fuels and put more efficient used cars on the market for working families to buy, for those of us that buy used cars. We're not joining the TCI, which means we're not making any appreciable changes for the average Vermonter in reducing their expenses for commuting, and that's something we need to tackle, and we'll see if we get it done this year. I serve on the Finance Committee. Finance Committee will get most of the bills in the next 2 weeks, and then we will do our work reviewing what other committees have worked on having to do with taxes, fees, and insurance issues. I serve on Natural Resources. This year, Natural Resources is trying to make some changes to Act 250 and has several hunting bills. I call those bills, that committee is dealing with culture wars. There are people that want to build everywhere, anytime, as quickly as possible, and others that wish to preserve wildlife and wildlife corridors and the attractions that bring people here to Vermont. We'll see what bills we get out. The most difficult task is reaching compromises between the people on either extreme, and it's difficult work. I'm not going to take any more time. The best about these forums is answering questions from people that call in. So take the next person up, please, Perry.
Thanks, Mark. We're going to go to our representative list, and next will be Sarah Copeland-Hansis.
Good morning. It's so nice to be with you all this morning for our Orange County Legislative Breakfast. I am Sarah Copeland-Hansis from Bradford. I chair the House Government Operations Committee, and I'm co-chair of the Legislative Climate Solutions Caucus, both of which are keeping me very busy this year. I'll just briefly explain to you what's going on in House Government Operations, because I'm looking forward to hearing from the other representatives and hopefully getting to questions before I have to bail out of here around 10. The House Government Operations Committee is immersed in our decennial redistricting. So the senators talked a little bit about this on the Senate side. The House develops a House redistricting plan separate from the Senate plan. And for the most part, there hasn't been a lot of population shift in Orange County. And so there isn't likely to be a great deal of change in terms of the overall configuration. The one change that we are looking at that impacts Orange County, though, is I have felt for a long time that rural two-seat legislative districts that encompass multiple towns are a challenge, both for the citizens of those very large districts and for the legislators who represent them. And so overall in the Vermont map, unless rural communities are really saying, yes, please keep us together, we like being in a 6 or 7 or 8 town two-seat district, we're looking at ways to divide those rural two-seat districts into single-seat districts so that legislators live closer to their constituents, and so that as municipal leaders need to reach out to their representative, they can get a little more time and attention from their representative who maybe is only representing 3 or 4 towns instead of 6 or 7 or 8 towns, as we've seen in some places. So that is really the only shift that is going to impact Orange County as it currently stands. There's a proposal to break up what is the Orange 1 district, which is 6 towns, into a two-town single-seat district and a 4-town single-seat district. So the proposal is for Chelsea and Williamstown to be in a single-seat district. And then that would leave Orange, Washington, Corinth, and Berkshire in a single-seat district. And that is the only change in Orange County, because the rest of the districts really didn't have any shift in population and are relatively compact and contiguous. So that is the main project of the House Government Operations Committee. We have at this point sealed the map, frozen it, locked it. We've made all the decisions we need to. And during this town meeting recess, Legislative Council is drafting all the language that goes along with the map, because the redistricting has to pass like a bill, and a bill has to be words on the page, not a picture of a district, but the actual words that describe it. So all of that drafting is being done right now, and as soon as we get back into session next week, we will begin going through that with a fine-tooth comb, making sure that the words on the page accurately describe the configuration that we saw on the map. And I would expect it should pass out of committee by the end of next week. So that's all from House Government Operations land, and hopefully I'll still be around for Q&A for later on. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Sarah. By the way, I want to let everybody know that we are going to go to at least 11 o'clock for those people who can stay. So next, let's go to Jay Hooper.
Thank you, Perry, and to the Orange County Democrats for hosting. Thank you, Bob, the green guy, for putting on the production and for being green. My name is Jay Hooper. I represent the 5 towns of Brookfield, Braintree, Randolph, Granville, and Roxbury. And my understanding, as we've just heard from Representative Copeland-Hansis, is that my district is indeed locked in, which I was very pleased to learn last week. In my committee, my proudest moment so far this session has been in advocating for the state colleges to get what they've asked for. Fully funding their base funding request and the bridge funding. When the select committee came to House Education to ask for I think it was 48 million plus the 7 in bridge funding, I said we have no reason not to trust their work, despite the fact that sort of some of the members of the committee were suggesting like we shouldn't be so sure if we're going to do this. I thought, geez, we made an investment last year and the year before in our budget, and it would make no sense to backpedal on the making sure that the future of the state colleges works. And so, like I say, my proudest moment was pointing out to the chair of my committee. I said, Madam Chair, if we gave the thumbs up this week to just about every different entity that came to ask for money, we almost stayed almost wholly impartial. We failed to weigh in on our priorities. So I just want to take this opportunity to be on the record that I wouldn't want to support a budget that doesn't, like I say, fully fund the state colleges. Upcoming in education is the pupil weighting policies that are, so the pupil weighting task force issued a report to the legislature that basically highlights 2 general options for a path forward as to how we update, and I know Senator Mcdonald doesn't like this word, but modernize our education funding formula for public education in Vermont. And the tricky thing about this topic is it's so complex that it's very difficult to talk casually about the changes that are going to be made. So we're talking about the weights, W-E-I-G-H-T. They're the factors, the variables by which we determine the average cost per pupil district to district. And currently the formula operates under 4 different variables, and we really need to bring it up to 8 as to the report. So the trick, like I say, the tricky thing is going to be getting all the rest of the General Assembly, anybody who hasn't been studying this topic closely, up to speed before we vote. And we really hope to vote on something this session, because it is urgent that we make sure that we're providing students in Vermont the most equitable education that we can. So I've been trying to discuss casually this topic on the radio each Saturday from 11 to noon. I've covered this issue maybe 8 or 12 different weeks with various representatives coming on from the task force. I've had Scott Beck, I've had Senator Hooker, and like I say, it's very difficult to discuss such a complex topic routinely. So other than that, redistricting, let's see, what else did we do? We enshrined in the state constitution reproductive rights. So that'll go to the voters, I think, next election. But let's see, with a lack of direction, I'm just going to pass it on here. Thank you, Perry.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Let me see. Let me look at my list here. I'd like to go to.
Let's see. I'm serve on Ways and Means. As many of you know, in the House, we only get 1 committee, although the things that we work with are frequently shared with other committees. To talk a little bit about per pupil weighting, as Representative Hooper just spoke about a little bit, but the things that haven't been touched on, except very briefly, one is the fee bill that Senator Kitchell talked about. Heretofore, up until a few years ago, we had a fee bill every year. There are fees scattered throughout state government all over the place. Things like driver's licenses, but also stormwater permits. There's a lot of permits that come from Department of Agriculture having to do with food and whatnot. And fees are things that actually pay for the service. My dog here is trying to nudge me, so if I'm wiggling around, excuse me. Service rendered. Much of the Agency of Natural Resources, Environmental Conservation, throughout the transportation budget and other places, there are a lot of fees, and Governor Scott has declined, shall we say politely, to introduce a fee bill for several years now. And so many agencies and departments are becoming underfunded because they haven't been able to increase fees commensurate with costs, inflation and whatnot, and work to be done. So we're at a bit of a quandary as to how to handle that, because we can't make a fee bill on our own without the active participation of the administration. So maybe there'll be more on that from time to time. Our fear is that when the dam finally breaks and the then governor, whether it's Governor Scott or some other governor, says, oh yes, by the way, we need to look at the fees, the increase may be so large that people will gasp, rightly so, and say, why are you doing this all of a sudden after 10 years or something to that effect? But anyway, we'll set that aside for a minute, but that is something that needs to be addressed, and we know it, as do many employees in the state government agencies and departments that are funded by fees. I'll talk briefly about the per pupil weighting issue that Representative Hooper spoke about. As those of you who know, who have been on school boards or whatnot, school funding, we fund schools on a per pupil basis, and the per pupil count, each school has been mathematically altered by the weights, one for poverty, one for English as a second language, and on, high school, middle school, and on down. And one of the things that we learned last year, if we didn't know it before, is the weights that we use currently weren't based on empirical data. They were just made up a number of years ago because someone liked them. It actually, I believe, I know it predates Act 60. So this was quite a while ago, and they're wildly out of whack, and we're trying to look at various ways to address that and bring them into the world of accuracy. The good news is that will increase the ability of school systems where they have been underweighted. It'll increase their taxing capacity, because tax capacity is based on per pupil spending, and if the per pupils numbers have been too low, they've been unable to raise sufficient taxes to educate their populace. But there'll be other districts that will hoot and holler, probably because it's been so long since the weights have been corrected, that they'll find that their taxing capacity for the same school system will be reduced. Serious matter. So, and as Representative Hooper knows, and other people who follow this, we're a long ways from deciding exactly how to address the problem, although we recognize that it needs to be done, and there will probably be a lead-in time from where we are to where we need to go, but that is something that people will certainly want to watch. Another thing that Ways and Means is looking at is potentially changing the way we fund education from one that's basically property tax based to one that for the resident population would be income tax based. As some people know who scrutinize their property taxes, many Vermonters pay 3 different property taxes when they send in the check. There is non-residential, commercial property, which is taxed throughout the state pretty much at one uniform rate. There is your homestead, which is where you live, and there's the home site. The home site is your house and 2 acres, and that is available to be calculated based on your income. That is what becomes the state payment, income sensitivity. And then there's the back acreage, but if it's part of your homeland, home site, anyway, we've got so many terminologies, they drive me crazy. But anyway, that's taxed at a different rate. And you on your property tax may be paying 3 different taxes depending on what you have there. It's wildly complicated, drives people crazy, and the complexity in itself is a reason to change it. And there are many people who would substantially like to see us have an income-based school tax. That has been looked at a couple of times in Ways and Means, both before my time and just within the last couple of years. And those who want to follow what we're thinking about can go to the Ways and Means Committee page and look down by witness for Deb Brighton. Deb is a fiscal analyst who's frequently works at the JFO office. She's not a direct employee, but a subcontractor, I guess you could say. But she's a master, that's probably the right word, at figuring out charts and graphs and things that demonstrate graphically what we're talking about. And I would advise anybody who wants to know what we're thinking about to go to the Ways and Means Committee page and sort this out to their best of their knowledge, and then call us up and say, what on earth are you doing? Or please or not, you know. The last time a income-based education funding bill actually was, well, considered, I think it was before I got onto Ways and Means. There was one question which is still before us, which was never really answered, which is if everybody's income tax in a given town is based on their income, their personal income, the gross adjusted income from your 1040, is there a cap on the amount of your income that might be subject to the house education income tax? How come? Here's just something to think about. If you live in a town where most of the people are middle class or below, and you have 1 or 2 high rollers who have an income on an annual basis of $1 million or more, if we're all paying on a percentage, those couple of taxpayers would pay quite a lot of money, even if it's just a percentage of their income. It would be quite a lot. And the consideration is, would it be fair in a given town, Podunk, for example, if when we go to pass our school budget, we're saying to ourselves, well, there's just 2 families here that are going to pay a huge percentage of this budget, and the rest of us get a much lower ride. And one way to address that might be to have a cap on how much income could be subject to the house education income tax. So we don't know the answer to that. We're just beginning to work our way through these, but we know that where money's involved, politics intervenes, and we'll have to work our way through this as this session proceeds. And I don't know whether or not we would vote out a bill this session or whether we'd kick it down the road. The one thing I can tell you is every time we move it along, we do actually do more work on it, and we get closer and closer to resolving what we need to do to try to figure out how we'd vote the bill. One other thing, quite different, is cannabis. Cannabis is said to be, or I think regulation, state law says it'll be available commercially in the fall, maybe November. And one of the things that concerns that legislation is the fees that sellers and producers would pay to the state and to towns to fund the program. There's 2 policy things under consideration that I agree with. I don't know if we'll be able to meet the challenge. One is to fund the Cannabis Control Board and their activities through fees without taking money or appropriating money from the general fund. If we can do it through fees, then there won't be an incentive to play around with the resources by using general fund money, which I hope we don't have to do, but we'll have to wait and see. One of the things that's in consideration there is the fact that the Cannabis Control Board proposed, I think correctly, that they're going to try to keep the fees at a certain target with two things in mind. They want to make them sufficiently modest so that local producers can afford them. And then our cannabis that's produced in state will be locally produced rather than, and also by state entities, rather than having out-of-state enterprises, whatever they want to call themselves, whether they're camouflaged as local or not, sweep in and run the cannabis market in the state of Vermont. In Colorado, Washington, Oregon, for example, states where that has occurred, things have not gone very well. So there's a conflict between trying to keep the fees low enough so that local producers can afford them, but sufficiently robust so that we can fund the program. And we're not sure where will come out. The Cannabis Control Board, which is part of our cannabis law, has proposed some fees that may be adequate. We're not quite done working through. Again, stay tuned. The other thing is, as you know, the law requires that if a town wants to have a dispensary, a sales place within the town has to vote affirmatively on that, as Hartford and other towns near us will be doing on Tuesday. It'll be interesting to see how that works out. My concern personally with the cannabis law is that I don't think there's sufficient resources available to prevent substance abuse in younger kids, for which we now learn more and more is very, very harmful. We don't do that great a job with alcohol, and I'm not sure how well we'll do with cannabis either, but that is, cannabis is out there, marijuana is out there, whether we like it or not. It has been for quite some period of time. And also people who follow the issue know cannabis, which is sold on the black market, frequently is laced with fentanyl, opioids, and things which can bring people an unexpected high, and in some cases, death. So it's a problem, but these problems have been around since Al Capone, I guess you could say, and so, or way before that. So there's nothing new here. This is just something that this generation has to deal with. Let's see what else we have.
Jim?
Yeah.
I'd like to try to finish the introductions fairly soon. So could we stop there?
Well, I was just about done, Barry, except to say you can follow, honestly, you can follow any of us in committee anytime on Zoom. And depending on where the camera is in our committee room, it either looks like we're looking at the cameras, I'm now looking at you, or if there's a fisheye camera sitting off to my side, when I'm concentrating, it looks like I'm staring out the window. But you're welcome anytime. Things are recorded, and you can follow our proceedings with regards to any of these topics in any committee, House or Senate. And please do, and get back to us and say, what are you doing? Or could you please? That's part of our job, to be responsive. So thank you very much, Perry.
Thanks for that invitation, Jim. I'm going to go to Tim Briglin next.
So I'm Tim Briglin. I serve with Jim Maslin to represent two towns in Orange County, Thetford and Stratford. And Jim and I also represent Sharon and Norwich in Windsor County. House members, I don't think this has been mentioned, House members only serve on one committee. Senators serve on two committees. And the committee that I serve on is the Energy and Technology Committee. And I'll just mention a few things that we've been working on this year. We passed an artificial intelligence bill early in the session, and that was a bill that basically relates to how artificial intelligence is used within state government. There are issues around implicit bias and civil liberties issues related to artificial intelligence being used as in state IT systems, and that bill basically looks at those particular issues. My committee 2 or 3 weeks ago passed a municipal energy resilience bill. And it's basically a bill that is working off of state programs that are basically helping state buildings become more energy efficient through weatherization and moving away from fossil fuels. This bill looks to expand that program and basically implement it at the municipal level. There are about 2,000 buildings that are owned and run by municipalities, and they are some of the oldest, least energy efficient buildings in the state. And so this program would basically support towns in creating plans to make those buildings more efficient, move away from fossil fuels, and toward beneficial electrification, and basically support that work with funding from the state level. Actually, it would come out of some of the ARPA dollars that have come to the state of Vermont. Third bill that my committee spent quite a bit of time on is called the Clean Heat Standard Bill. And that's essentially a bill that would support homeowners, but also businesses in Vermont move to cleaner heat alternatives and away from fossil fuel use. And it would essentially bring fuel suppliers into a regulated space in Vermont. In the state of Vermont, there are different types of energy that are highly regulated, for example, electricity, but the fuels that we use to heat our homes really are an unregulated space. And so what this bill would look to do is basically obligate folks who are selling fossil fuel to support a transition to make our homes more efficient, make our businesses more efficient, and use less fossil fuel, and create a path to ultimately get to, again, what I would call beneficial electrification and use cleaner energy sources to heat with. A couple other things I'll mention. My committee has been very focused on some of the issues around appropriating federal dollars, and there have been two proposals that we have spent quite a bit of time looking at. One is the governor has proposed a plan to fund 100 cell towers being located around the state for increasing cell phone service. That's something my committee spent a fair amount of time on and will in the coming months as well. And then the other relates to how we support our IT systems in state government. Whether it's at the DMV or the unemployment insurance program, how we support daycare providers. A number of the IT systems we have in state government are really old and don't work very well. And one of the things we're looking at is using more of the one-time ARPA dollars to support modernization of those IT systems. So that's just a quick run through, Perry, of some of the stuff my committee's working on.
Thanks, Tim. John O'Brien, would you give us your information, please?
Sure. Thank you, Perry, and Sherry and Bob and the rest of the OC Dems for this session here. It's also interesting for me to listen to the other senators and representatives here, because usually we're just locked in committee and we don't really get to hear what everybody's up to. And thanks for all the other guests listening in here. I recognize a bunch of names. These are definitely the advocates and watchdogs who all keep us on our toes. And I know even from Tunbridge here, we've got Sylvie, Todd, Eileen, a bunch of people. So we probably all recognize a lot of these icons in real life because they're always at select board meetings and town meetings and getting in touch with us. One of my interests is just civics in general and trying to increase the amount of like these people today, residents, voters, advocates, getting involved in our government, our state government. And so it's always interesting to talk about what we do as senators and representatives. Like it's great that it's come up today that senators each serve on 2 committees and the House members just on 1. I'm always amazed at the senators because they not only do they have to serve on 2 committees, but they also cover, or they're beholden to a lot more constituents, of course. And so, and they're in general much older than the House representatives. So, but they somehow maintain Representative Hooper's youthful enthusiasm. So they're kind of freaks of nature. there are also, one thing I tell people who are interested in that have policy questions, is that the chairs of committees are enormously important, and there were a bunch here today. So Representative Briglin, chair of Energy and Technology. Almost all the senators at some point chair a committee because there are fewer of them and they're on more committees. Representative Maslin, I think you're still vice chair, right, of Ways and Means, Jim? And so Representative Hooper and I we're the lowly worms of just foot soldiers in committees, but Jay's actually been there a term longer, so he probably knows his way around a lot more than I do. I'm just finishing up my second term, and I represent Royalton and Tunbridge, which is tricky because one town's in Windsor and one's in Orange. I serve on House Agriculture and Forestry, which is a policy committee. And so we've been wrestling with a bunch of subjects. One is neonicotinoids, a pesticide family that's used. I can go into more of that if anybody's really interested. It's very complicated, mostly because there seems to be science that shows neonicotinoids or neonics as they're called, are detrimental to both our managed pollinators, honeybees, but just pollinators in general and all the sort of bug world. And if that would be the smoking gun, and we could probably ban neonics, except there's so many other stressors on pollinators that there isn't a definitive smoking gun. So things like climate change, habitat loss, etc., plus all this pesticide use is doing them in, and it's quite scary when we hear the beekeepers saying that every winter they're replacing something like 50% of their colonies. And any other, imagine dairy farmers saying like 50% of my cows died last winter and I have to replace them. That's how serious it is. We've also been doing a lot of research on payment for ecosystem services, which is fascinating. It's coming. It's just everybody's trying to figure out where's the money to pay for this. But our farmers have been doing a great job in Vermont. Pretty much leads the country in having the best soil now, which is pretty outstanding. And then we took some testimony on it, but I think it went through Ways and Means. Representative Maslin could speak more to this, but the House just passed a bill on adding reserve forest land to the current use program. So we're at the moment, what they talk about, they say there's something called old forests, and these are not just 200-year-old beautiful forest of 200-year-old pine trees in a forest. It's the sort of biodiversity of getting a 150-year-old forest, and you have everything. You have old trees there, dead trees, young trees, and there are great benefits to that. At the moment, Vermont only has 1% old forest, and we want to get to something like 9 or 10%. So this is saying you can actually, that's my dog, manage, they'll add if you have it on, if you're a property owner and you want to, you can add reserve forest and manage your forest like that, because it's going to take a while, but the only way you get to old forest is starting now. So that's a pretty interesting bill. So I'll stop there and we can get to questions while we still got a few people on.
Thanks a lot, John. There has been quite a number of questions on a similar topic about the bill that the Energy and Technology Committee was working with on Clean Air Act issues, on Biofuels Act. In fact, one of the questioners just posed a question about what's the understanding about the concept of renewable natural gas and liquid biofuels as to whether they're clean or cleaner. So I'm going to pose that question. I'm not well versed in it myself, but I do know that Tim Briglin is. And Tim, I'm going to throw that either softball or hardball to you.
So the Clean Heat Standard bill that my committee has worked on, it's now in the Appropriations Committee in the House. Just, some background as to what that bill is about. Essentially, a third of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Vermont come from how we heat our water, how we heat our homes. As Senator Mcdonald had mentioned earlier, it's the second largest greenhouse gas emitting function in our state. The largest is transportation. And the most prominent policy to address transportation emissions, unfortunately, is now off the table. So, one of the things that we're trying to focus on this session is how do we address reducing fossil fuel emissions from heating our homes? And I would say that this issue is even harder to address than transportation. With transportation, we replace our cars every so many years. With our homes and with businesses, there are over 300,000 homes, for example, in the state of Vermont. Half of them were built before 1975, so many are quite energy inefficient. And the equipment that we use to heat our homes, typically some sort of combustion furnace, that's essentially the piece of equipment that pushes the greenhouse gas emitting materials into the air. And we don't replace those furnaces very frequently, and they're expensive to replace. So it's very much an unregulated place, and there are lots of homes that are old and inefficient, and roughly 98% of Vermonters use some source of carbon emitting fuel to heat their homes, whether it's wood or gas or fuel oil or all of the above, in the case of some folks. The Clean Heat Standard is something that was pulled together by a group of folks working with the Energy Action Network. And it was looked at by the Climate Council that was formed as part of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and is one of the recommendations of the climate plan that was put together out of the work that they did last year. But essentially what it does is it brings fossil fuel sellers in our state into a more regulated space. And it essentially obligates those who sell heating fuel to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are related to that sale. It does it in a measured, predictable, sustainable way. So it doesn't go from 100 to 0 in 2 years. It basically is looking to comply with the emissions reduction requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. So we're looking to reduce our emissions levels in the heating space by 40% by 2030, and then by 80% and taking them to net zero by 2050. And how do you do that? Basically, the bill outlines 3 pathways, but there are certainly more. But the primary one is, and the thing that you have to do first is related to efficiency and weatherization. Where we ultimately want to get to is heating our homes with energy that is clean and renewable, which will essentially be renewably generated electricity. But before we put those types of mechanisms in our homes, they have to be our homes have to be well weatherized. They have to have a tighter thermal envelope, if you will, and that involves weatherization. One of the things that we're focused on in the appropriations bills, and Jane had mentioned this earlier, is directing a significant amount of state money towards supporting people weatherizing their homes. Over the next, I think it's 3 or 4 years, we're directing about $130 million towards that. That's triple what we have done historically. But the problem with weatherization is we don't have a sustainable funding source to keep that weatherization work going on beyond, say, 2025. And a clean heat standard would be essentially a funding mechanism to keep that weatherization work going and accelerating that work through the end of the decade. Another pathway that a clean heat standard looks at is how do we use, and this is the most controversial, I think, about the bill, is how do we reduce the fossil fuel intensity of how we heat our homes currently? As I said, most Vermonters use fossil fuels to heat their homes right now. And it's going to be difficult for folks to move from, where we are today, using oil and gas, to immediately going to electricity, just because of the cost of that change and also the weatherization that needs to precede that change. So one of the things in the bill is it would allow biofuels, wood, to be qualified as a less carbon intensive fuel than using, for example, number 2 fuel oil. But again, that's on the pathway to ultimately getting to homes in Vermont that are primarily heated by renewable, hopefully locally generated electricity. So that, again, that's a brief overview of what the bill intends to do, Perry. But I'm not sure if I pulled off into a tangent there or not.
Well, let me follow up just a bit on that, Tim, because a number of the questions then seem to be honing on the issue of what constitutes genuinely a renewable biofuel, mm-hmm. and whether or not some of those renewable biofuels are resulting from out-of-state gas fracking.
Well, and just to be clear, I'm still unmuted. Yeah, about 25% of Vermonters, mostly folks who live in Addison, Chittenden, and Franklin County, heat their homes with fracked gas that they purchase from Vermont Gas. It's the only gas utility in the state, and the pipeline that they have and the connection that they have to people's homes is in that part of the state. I just want to be clear. I suspect that the person who was asking that question, and again, I can't see the chat, was asking something slightly different. But just changing, for example, from number 2 fuel oil to natural gas certainly does not qualify for clean heat credits under this bill. But I suspect what they were asking was, questions around injecting, for example, farm generated methane from a manure digester, injecting that into a natural gas pipeline or a fracked gas pipeline. Would that qualify for clean heat credits? It would in a certain circumstance. It would if the manure gas methane was not only displacing the fracked gas, but also is not being counted for other emissions reductions. So one of the things that we're concerned about is that there's going to be double counting for different sorts of emissions reductions. If a farm digester, again, is that methane that's being generated is being used to heat, then it can count towards reducing emissions in the heating sector. But if that farmer is using that, that gas to count towards emissions that we're hoping to achieve in the agricultural sector, then that's where it's going to count. And we want to be very clear as to not double counting what that gas is used for.
Okay. There's still been a number of questions that seem to want to go into a great deal of detail, legitimate, I assume, about the gas issue, about gas coming from Alberta, about what the House committee did about that. And I since this is not a forum designed to be a debate back and forth on one issue, I'm going to ask the people who are concerned about that to continue to contact members of the legislature, including the Appropriations Committee, who is now going to be dealing with funding issues, and to express their concerns, because I think they have very strong concerns about it. I will ask any other of the legislators to comment on this before we move on. And I see Mark has his hand up.
Thanks, Perry. Jay and I were joke about the word modernization, and when we did, Jay talked about how the issues we deal with are often quite complex, and if you go into all the details, the listeners drift off. So that's always the back and forth. We've just had a discussion about fuels and weatherization, and I wanted to kind of bring what Jay and I joke about into being serious. The Natural Resources in the Senate is working on a weatherization bill, and it is complex. And to understand it, you need to understand how we purchase automobiles today. 70 years ago, you bought an automobile. If you wanted to get it fixed, you went to a service station that was usually at a gas station. Today, you go to a dealership. They market it on TV. The sales are at dealerships. The salespersons show you the cars. The financing is there. You can sign financing for 5 years. There are payment systems through banks, through checking accounts, through credit cards. There is the people that work on the cars are certified. They've been to school. The certificates are on the wall as if they were a doctor or podiatrist that has the certificate on the wall. They charge you 70, 80, 90 bucks an hour. They have warranties good 4 years. They have the cars are certified. The design doesn't take place in your home. It takes place in Detroit. The liability for poor cars is serviced by the Lemon Law, and the procedures for selling your car are all administered by the Department of Motor Vehicles. I mentioned these details because when it comes to weatherizing people's homes, there needs to be a system designed to market people to be interested in it. There has to be a place to conduct the sale. There has to be an inspection of the homes, not in the dealership, but in your home. There have to be financing systems that are as easy to operate. There have to be payment systems that are acceptable to pay for the weatherization over time. The workforce has to be trained at places like VTC, labor unions, and some independent contractors that are training their own people. The design for your house has to take place in your house, not in Detroit. The inspections have to take place because public money is being spent and someone has to make sure that the work was actually done. That's taken place with automobiles when it comes off the assembly line. There has to be liability for poor workmanship so that customers and the citizens can be reimbursed. And there have to be the procedures that when your property sells, the cost of that hasn't been paid travels with the property. These are all details. And when Jay Hooper says that the weatherization program has to modernize what we do, he's absolutely right. Your Natural Resources Committee in the Senate is providing for each of those things that I listed in the long list that have probably made people fall off the edge of the world while they were listening to us go through the list. It is complicated, it is complex, and when it's finished, people will say, my goodness, that's complicated. Can't you simplify it? Well, the automobile industry simplified it. It took them 70 years to become an overnight success in how to market, sell, and distribute automobiles. And before I leave automobiles, one of the facts that we should know today, in spite of our regulations for making automobiles be more efficient, the automobiles that we sell and they're being purchased today, on average, get worse gas mileage than the ones that sold last year, worse than the year before, and worse than the year before that. And those are the automobiles that 5 years from now and for the next 12 years will be on our used car lots and that we and our neighbors will be buying. We are falling behind in automobile fossil fuel reduction, in spite of the gains we're making with electric cars. So that's my complex discussion of how to modernize something. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I have some other questions here that I'm going to put out to the group of legislators. We know that the governor recently vetoed a bill trying to close what's called the Charleston loophole regarding background checks and the amount of time and before people can acquire firearms. The questions seem to be directed at, excuse me, is there going to be a legislative effort to overturn that veto?
I think we are going to look to alter that bill and send it back to the governor. Again, I think the issue was focused on the Charleston loophole, not the issues around restricting having guns in hospitals, which, gosh, I would hope would not be controversial. But I think the issue was around the Charleston loophole, and I think the governor's concern was that it was potentially an open-ended path to allowing folks to not be able to purchase a gun because their background check didn't go through. And I don't know what the actual answer is going to be to that, but I'm presuming that it will reduce and set a particular time frame in statute for for the ability to purchase a gun if the background check isn't completed by a certain time frame.
Jim?
The bill that passed was 30 days for the during which time a background check could be conducted, and if it wasn't done after 30 days, as opposed to now when it's only 3 days, the purchaser could walk back to the store and pick up his gun. Maybe we'll end up with a week, 7 days, 10 days. It's still a vast improvement over 3 days. And I'm hoping, I think that that's where we'll end up, with some sort of a compromise that we can agree to and the governor signs.
There is apparently concern about whether the weatherization efforts can succeed when you have properties that are rentals. And is there any effort occurring to try to deal with that?
Well, there's considerable amount of money in different kinds of housing programs, as Senator Kitchell pointed out. Some of them have to do with renovating rental properties. I don't know if what we'll finally see is specifically going to deal with weatherization in rental properties, but it certainly needs to. There are many of them wildly heat inefficient, and it stands to reason if you're doing anything to your rental property, some of it should, by rule, if not design, include a substantial amount of weatherization. After all, whoever lives there, whether it's the landlord or the tenant, is paying for heat, for Pete's sake. And why on earth send the heat out the window? That's a short answer, but I think that's what we have to recognize. And I don't know what the provisions of the final bill will be, but we collectively are aware that weatherization and rental properties needs to be addressed.
Thanks, Jim.
The tenants pay for the heat. It's not the landlord's interest to get the job done. That's a marketing problem. And secondly, if you are a landlord with a building with 10 tenants, you got to get people to move out and to be out of the place when the work's being done. And that's a logistical problem. Those are the two barriers for the difficulties that have to be resolved for apartments. And that's the beginning and end of that.
To try and answer the question, the $150 million that I'd mentioned that is partially ARPA money, partially money that Vermont annually spends on weatherization. Roughly 50 million of it, so call it a third of that. Actually, it would be more than that now that I think of it. So probably 40% of that money is going to be directed to low income weatherization. So that is, if there's a low income person living in an apartment, that apartment could certainly qualify for it. There's particular parts of our weatherization programs that are focused on multi-unit housing, so essentially rental properties. So there is a focus in the existing weatherization programs we have right now that are on low income folks, as well as multi-unit properties, or a person or a family that's living in a rental property could qualify for that type of benefit, if you will. So those processes are in place. I think we got to do more, because as Mark had essentially outlined, typically when you sign a lease, there are certain things that come with the come in the rent that you pay for that apartment, and very often heating is not part of that. So it's essentially a regressive tax on folks, as to what they have to pay for heating those apartments. But there is resources that are currently directed towards those things. The other thing I would say, and again, not to dwell on the clean heat standard bill, but we do talk in the legislation about directing the work of clean heat credits towards low and moderate income folks. And in fact, 2/3 of the credits for residential homeowners or renters will be directed at folks that either make a moderate income or below. A lot of that work is going to be weatherization. And as I said, even with the huge amount of money that we're putting toward weatherization in the next few years, that money's going to run out when the federal money runs out. And one of the challenges we've had in maintaining our weatherization programs in Vermont, some of you may recall 10 years ago when we had some federal stimulus come in after the Great Recession, we dedicated a big chunk of that money towards weatherization, which was terrific. We built up all this weatherization infrastructure and workforce in the state of Vermont to do that work. And when the money ran out, those jobs started to go away. The infrastructure to support that weatherization work started to go away. And now we're trying to rebuild it. So one of the questions we have to answer, I think, as policymakers, as citizens of the state, is how are we going to maintain the resources to continue that weatherization work and to escalate it, to accelerate it? And once this federal money runs out, what's the pathway to do that? One of them would potentially be a clean heat standard.
Okay. What weight is given to the role of forests' carbon capture potential and help in mitigating climate change for your committee's policy deliberations?
A funny thing that happens often when there's a really good idea, then generally a study committee is appointed and maybe funded, and they go off and do research so that our bills aren't just like, let's write up something today and get it through. And so one of these, as far as forests go, I mean, there are a couple things going on. One was a study committee to look at state forest land and potentially enroll that in something like the California carbon markets, because it's a big block of forest. There also have been some private ventures like that. I think Middlebury College has done one. The Land Trust, I think, is doing one. And then also trying to figure out how, say you had 100 landowners who all wanted to get together and do this, how would that sort of thing work with the carbon offset markets? So we're waiting to get further research on that, just because it's incredibly complicated as far as the enrollment goes. You need a certain amount of vetting, and then you need experts to come and say, over the next 50 or 100 years, your forest block is going to either sequester or store so much carbon, and then how you get paid for that. So it's exciting. It's also, right, it's something very hard to quantify. And the best thing probably to do is, potentially it's a great revenue source for the state too. But even better would be just for Vermont because we're losing a certain amount of forest now, which is amazing when you look at, fly over Vermont, it seems like it's all forest. But forest fragmentation is happening, and we want to put the brakes on that and just start adding diversity to our forest here. One thing I learned this year was that difference between forests store a lot of carbon and young forests sequester it. So they start pulling carbon as they grow, they start pulling it out. And so even to find a balance between, carbon that's stored in wood, and if you use wood as a building product, so we could go back to energy and technology here, it keeps the carbon in it, and you want a certain amount of young forest growing to just be a carbon sink too. So even finding that balance is a policy issue for both our committee and Senate and Forest Parks and Technology in general.
Okay, thanks, John. Mark, go ahead.
2 comments. One, when John says forests store a lot of carbon, forests also store a lot of water. And we spend money on cleaning up the lake and then purifying water, and we spend money to sequester carbon. And forests are the one place where you can spend the same money to do 2 things at the same time. What competes against focusing the storage of both carbon and water, preventing flooding, keeping the lakes clean, is the competition for the folks who would like to build bigger and more expensive water treatment plants, where you put the money in and it does one purpose. It cleans up the water that's already gotten dirty. So John's committee's doing the right work because it kills 2 birds with 1 stone, and it uses any grant money we have more economically.
Thanks, Mark. What's going on as far as folks in the legislature about dealing with the algae blooms that have been plaguing Vermont waterways?
I haven't got a complete answer, Perry, or whoever's asking it, but I can tell you that one part of polluted waters around the state, algae blooms and whatnot, would help very much if the governor would propose a fee bill, because a lot of the work that gets done with regards to reducing algae blooms, and that some case has to do with farm runoff, not to pick on the farmers or any other kind of thing. Mark was talking about clean water. The work is done by the Environmental Conservation Department in conjunction with farmers or landowners or sewage treatment plants and or stormwater runoff. And if the DEC is improperly funded or not funded, it's very hard for them to do that work. So that is a not too subtle pitch for the governor to get in the saddle and introduce a fee bill so we can properly fund the people that need to do the work. Thanks.
Okay. Something that was sent to us as far as a question that before the meeting, and I'm going to address it, and that is the concern about the proliferation of ticks in the state, and how, for example, it is really a great threat to our moose population. Can anybody speak about that?
Well, just kind of wryly, but seriously, pray for colder winters.
Yep.
Genuine good old fashioned winters would help quite a bit.
We have a few more minutes left.
You had mentioned that there's some questions about clean heat standard stuff. So I'm happy to take that. I don't want to, to the extent that I can get into some of the complexity, if that's helpful or not, I'll try and stay at a high level.
I think, given obviously people have some very, very well-researched and thorough questions on all this stuff, I don't think we can, this methodology doesn't lend itself to simply that one topic getting deeper and deeper and deeper with the questions. And I think it'd be better for them to send those questions to you or arrange some kind of other forums where that could be dealt with. I do have a new question from somebody, and this is regarding Senate 158 legislation that will allow non-surgeons to perform surgery on eyes. As a retired OR nurse who spent many hours in the New England collaborative between all states to help deal with this problem. What do you think about that? In fact, I think I just merged two questions. Let me make sure I got it. Here we go. As a retired OR nurse who spent many hours in the ophthalmology operating room, I ask our senators to oppose this bill. Since we have one senator left, Mark, have you heard about that? Have you given any thought about that?
The bill is being discussed in health and welfare, and it is complex. Doctors are rightfully concerned that if this is a two-step process. If there's going to be some surgery, someone has to diagnose the surgery and conclude that it ought to happen, and would do tests to discover any related things that could go wrong or possible causes. And then the second part of the issue is, would people who are not don't do the diagnoses and look at the other things be permitted to do the actual surgery? And those are two separate questions. And the bill, I think when it was proposed, didn't separate into two parts. And until we get a recommendation from the health and welfare committees on how to proceed to see that more people get it, without risking their without risk to the patients, we won't have an answer. So that was a long time to say something that has not yet been answered. So.
Thank you, Mark. Another comment about the tick issue is, what about CRISPR gene technology to help the tick problem, or a New England collaborative between all the states to help us deal with the problem?
I didn't mean to, be flippant about the tick. Maybe that's a good suggestion. We could look into that. I'll write it down. But to go back to the question that was, the question to Mcdonald about optometry versus ophthalmology, I think that's an interesting controversy that I still have yet to fully grasp, because my understanding is that ophthalmologists have quite a few years more than optometrists do in the way of higher education. And basically the less educated of the two professions is asking for more privilege in the surgery on the surgery table. And that's a little daunting to the ones who consider themselves more knowledgeable about those procedures. So I guess to answer Sherry's question, I would be pretty curious to know what's the disparity there, and what would be the safest. Maybe indeed voting against that policy would be. I'd be curious to see why it's so straightforward to one group and not to the other. So,
go ahead, Jim.
I'd like to answer that somewhat indirectly, which is, I haven't read the bill I haven't heard testimony on what we should do one way or the other, but I can answer it indirectly with regards to another medical field, which is nurse anesthetologists. I have a daughter who's soon to be a certified nurse anesthetologist, and she'd like to move back to Vermont. The question is, it revolves around, in some states, nurse anesthetologists have to be supervised by a surgeon. And in other states, they do not. And I've heard, and so the certified nurse anesthetologists who are currently certified and licensed in Vermont, who want to protect their turf, can say, oh, don't let in a flood of certified ones unless they're similarly supervised, because it'll cut down on our income. That's a kind of a cynical comment, but it is what I hear on the ground out there. And so the question on which group of eye doctors, we'll call them, can do the diagnosis and which can do the surgery has very much to do with their training and who supervises them, I would say. As people who follow this sort of stuff know, two things. One, during the pandemic, Vermont and many states loosened up on a number of their regulations with regards to certain medical professions so that we could simply have enough people here who could actually do the work, because there was a shortage of healthcare professionals in many fields. And some will say, I mean, for instance, if this were my eyes and I were going to have some surgery, by golly, I'd like to have someone do the work who is actually very well qualified and vetted to do that work, and not just, throw it open to someone else. So the point being, we will have to take a lot of testimony, anybody who's going to vote on this, and educate ourselves as to whether or not the people who are actually going to do the work are qualified to do it. And that very much has to do with how these professions are regulated in state. Probably something like this thing having to do with eye surgery will actually come to Ways and Means, because there'll be a fee associated. And so we'll take testimony, as we do with all kinds of everything else having to do with healthcare providers who pay fees. And at that point, I'll know a lot more than I do right now. But I understand the concern both ways. One, we need more healthcare professionals who can do certain procedures correctly under license, and patients can be assured that they're getting quality care. And we also need to figure out a way to include as many people as we can in our system so that we don't run short. So I'm answering indirectly, but I hope this helps people understand the issues that we grapple with when we try to work on bills such as this one. Thanks.
I would ask the legislators to speak to any other issues that they would wanted to speak to during this session, and go from there.
Jane Kitchell at the beginning talked about housing and Vermont's housing crisis. We need more housing for people to live in, quite frankly. And we have for years been putting money into renovation of older places and trying to build new ones. But we also have a problem with the houses that are for sale being purchased by people who would like to come to this state to live here, because it still has fewer ticks than where they might live, because its environment is good, because it has lower crime rates, because we have a libertarian spirit. And Vermont is a place where people who've vacationed here for years would like to come now that they are retired. So while we're trying to build and renovate houses and apartments and using the money that the federal government has made available for COVID, we have to, how do we guarantee or see that when they're built for people with low and moderate incomes, that they remain available to those groups for more than 15 years, which is the current limit for much of the housing, not all of it. And it used to be 30 years limits that the housing was guaranteed to be available for moderate income families. And now it's down to 15, which means you run the risk of having people move in, the kids go to school, and then after 15 years, landlords can, in some cases, can say, well, your 15 years is up, and we're going to ask you to leave, and we're going to now rent the housing to the highest bidder. So while housing is being purchased by out of state, values are going up, people's appraisals are going up. That's the reason that we have surplus in the education fund, is that we've got more people paying taxes on houses that are worth more. Any time you deal with an issue, there's usually more than just one consideration. There's something is being balanced against something else. And we're wrestling to see that the money we put into affordable housing, that housing remains affordable for decades to come. So complicated. Some would say we're trying to modernize our housing policy, but that would be an oversimplification. Thank you.
Good. Jim, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Representative Hooper, I believe, mentioned how proud he was to vote to continue funding for the Vermont State College system. I'd like to put in a plug for the VSC, both colleges and universities. Sometimes people look at it as a consideration just of money, but we ought to recognize that the Vermont State Colleges educate Vermonters, many of whom actually stay here, build families, settle down and contribute to the economy of the state. But more than that, the state colleges provide workforce training from some very essential workers here, healthcare workers, childcare workers, mental health care workers, a host of technological fields. What they provide to Vermont in terms of workforce training is too often overlooked and absolutely essential. There was just some stuff study, whatever, introduced recently having to do with VTC, where it turns out return on investment, dollars spent, dollars out. VTC is top in the state and 7th in the whole United States in terms of return on investment, dollars you spend to go there and dollars you earn when you get out. So that's quite remarkable. We ought to keep that in mind. Thanks.
Thank you, Perry. I just wanted to thank Jeffrey Gardner for the link to the report that, the VT conservation design is here. I recommend that other legislators also click the link and we follow up on his concerns. It seems to me like the theme of today's forum is mostly green energy, and some kind of controversy there. I wonder if, I guess I could put my phone number in the chat for anybody who wants to follow up with me as to the concerns regarding the clean heat standard. But I think there are other leaders in the forum that have done more work on this. So I guess I'm just looking to get a lesson from anybody who really wants to teach me something. So.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and do that, Jay? Put that in the chat so people can get at that. Yeah, Mark?
Several years ago, we were working on how to stimulate the purchase of electric cars, and someone said, well, we ought to get VTC to start a class on how to maintain and be of service to electric vehicles. And so we called the college, and the answer was, what do you mean start a program? We started one 8 months ago, and that's a college that offers the course before it gets asked to be offered, and it's up and running before those of us in the legislature think to give them a call and make a suggestion. They're already doing it, and that's pretty darn terrific.
Okay, Jim, you had your hand up.
Just to say, all of our email addresses and phone numbers, at least some phone number, is available on the legislative homepages, both Senate and House. And so we look forward to hearing from you, whatever you want to pull our chain about. It's all part of what's we take on as our responsibility. So please contact us, ask us questions, give us hell if you think we need it. But maybe we can help together work through some of these issues so we come up with better answers. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Just something I wanted to flag for people is kind of the questions around cell phone service. I know that there's going to be a lot of focus on that in the next 2 or 3 months. It's something that's been a hot topic in Thetford in the last year, I guess, as there's been a proposal to build a cell phone tower here. I know it's been an issue in Chelsea. And, as you go north on 113, actually, even as you go over Thetford Hill and you're, half a mile off of Interstate 91, you start to lose cell phone service. So I suspect that Orange County is going to be a place in the state that is going to be on the list for places to put some of these 100 cell phone towers that the governor is interested in doing. And again, I think there's a lot of interest in that, but there's concern as well. So I just want to highlight that for folks that kind of keep attuned to what's going on with that issue.
Okay, thanks, Tim. John? John O'Brien, go ahead.
Yep. I just wanted to quickly, if I can do it in a compact way, go from ticks to dairy farming. One thing in the Senate does it too. I guess in the House, every morning we start off with a devotional, this 3-minute sort of thought piece. And I've been thinking of doing one called something like In Praise of Ticks, just because it reminds me of one of my favorite lines of Ralph Waldo Emerson is, what is a weed? A weed is something we don't know the value of. And so I'm trying to get my head around, are they good bugs? Are they bad bugs? What's wrong? Why are we so out of whack that, our young moose are covered with a coat of ticks and dying? And so, that sort of leads me back to this whole, our pollinators. And from there you go, okay, a honeybee's a good thing, right? A bumblebee's a good thing, or a hummingbird or monarch. But then there are all these other bugs too, that are they bad bugs? That the whole reason there's a company called Syngenta, which created the neonic, which they spray on a corn seed so that corn borers and wire worms, will be killed upon eating that seed. And this Syngenta, just to give you an idea of the scale, sold to ChemChina for $46 billion. So here we are, citizen legislatures trying to deal with these huge global companies and their sort of plan for our dairy farmers. So we get to this point where like, okay, let's protect the honeybees and our beekeepers in the state. And then our choice though is to say like, okay, we're going to ban the treated article, these seeds that are coated with neonics. And so no dairy farmers will be able to plant corn because it's almost impossible to find the so-called naked seeds, the seeds without this treatment. You have to order like a year in advance. So it's like we help beekeepers, we destroy our dairy industry here. And these sort of questions are what we're faced with all the time. There are no real, easy answers here. And sometimes it takes research, sometimes it takes years. But we try to find some balance here and come May, hopefully have some legislative solutions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John. Well, we're just on top of 11 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for attending. So thank you very much and have a good day. Bye-bye.